Donahue was gonna go over this. Did you need one of these? Yeah. Okay, might as well.
Well, thank you. I apologize for being late. I got caught in traffic on 95.
We understood being on traffic on 95 very well.
And a flight that got in late also, so just the gods were conspiring against me. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you all. You all are taking on a tremendous responsibility serving on the board of WPCA. You have an expensive asset, needs a lot of attention and care, and it's not inexpensive. So the things you're talking about are very, very pertinent. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background about me and my firm. We are financial and management people. We're not engineers. I've got engineers on staff. We don't do engineering work. We're not investment bankers. We don't sell bonds. We don't underwrite bonds, anything like that. We don't do construction management. What we do is provide financial and management advice related to environmental infrastructure, water, sewer, solid waste, stormwater. We work around the country, although we're heavily in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. We just finished some work in Manchester. We are starting some work up in Exeter, New Hampshire. We've worked all over New England for the last 35, 40 years. This is the kind of stuff we do, the kind of things you're talking about. So without anything more about us, let's get into your situation. You are, on page 3 there, if you're, you are feeling all kinds of pressures. The economic recovery hasn't bounced, the economy hasn't come back as quickly as we hoped it would. Well, it is steadily coming back. There's a lot of pressure on you all, and I don't need to tell you that, you know this already, in terms of your operating costs and people's resistance to rate and fee increases. That's normal. You have a changing workforce. I see it in my own employees. People don't have notion of going somewhere and working for 20 years anymore. They think they're going to come and stay 2 or 3 years and go do something else and all that kind of stuff. So different culture among the rising generation. Tied to that, of course, is all the retirements that are coming at us. A lot of the people that are in the water and sewer business now got into it when they got out of college in the 70s, when EPA was founded and Clean Water Act was passed and the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed. And those people are all getting to retirement age, and some of them are past retirement age. Some of them have been holding off on retirement because of the uncertain economy and trying to work longer than they otherwise normally would. There's always a problem of competition for good employees. We just finished doing some work for a utility out in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and they would hire plant operators. They were talking wastewater. They would hire plant operators, get them trained, get them licensed in 2 to 3 years, and then there was a utility about not quite 20 miles away that was offering a starting salary that was $18,000 higher than they were paying people after 2 years. So it's not surprisingly, they lost a lot of people to the other utility. And part of it was the fact that they were within the Department of Public Works, and so the Department of Public Works wanted to compare salaries for plant operators with other people in DPW, like street and maintenance people. And it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison. And so DPW was holding down the salaries for plant operators, hence they were losing them. We pointed out to them that the learning curve and just the training costs and getting people a license was more than offsetting any savings they were accomplishing by holding down the salaries. But that is something. Things happen a lot faster than they used to. We need to make decisions more quickly, and that's not always something that's easy to do in bureaucracy. And everybody's interested in the environment. Everybody at least says they're an advocate of the environment. Everybody wants clean water and clean air, but they always want somebody else to pay for it, is the problem. Some of the things we've learned in some of our prior studies, and please jump in with questions, don't,
That's what I was gonna ask.
Good.
You want us to interrupt as?
Absolutely,
if we have a
absolutely.
question?
This is supposed to be a
Could I ask you to
discussion.
do one thing, because
Sure.
we, I don't believe, at least in my memory, have ever done a cost of service. Could you just tell us really sort
sure.
of high level what it is?
Sure. Cost of service is the second step in developing rates. The first thing you need to do is to define your revenue requirement. What are your costs? How much does it cost you to operate and maintain your utility? So some things are obvious, like the operating cost, because you have an operating budget. Other things are obvious, but maybe not as blatantly so, like debt service on any debt you have outstanding right now. The third thing are your capital costs, because there are always more capital costs. I mean, and you're either going to have to pay for them by using, operating revenues, pay-as-you-go kind of money, or you're going to have to debt finance them. And there's always the temptation to debt finance them because it holds rates down now, but then you're mortgaging some of your revenues in the future when you do that. And then the last thing, the last part of the cost that form the revenue requirements are your reserves. You need to have some reserves. If you were an investor-owned utility regulated by Connecticut DPU, they would tell you to build 90 days operating cash into your rates. If there's something goes wrong, you sell less water, or you get less. If you get less sewage, if it's a dry year or something like that, or something goes wrong, you need some kind of operating reserve. And investor-owned utilities are told by the state to build 90 days into their rates. Some clients are more conservative than that. We have one client in Virginia, and she likes to have 2 years worth of operating cash on hand. And I'm astounded she can do it without being criticized and not being tried to pressure to lower rates, but that's their culture. But at least 90 days operating cash. And you also need a second kind of reserve, which we call 3R reserve: repairs, renewals, rehabilitation. Everybody in the country has pipes in the ground that aren't so obvious and are out of sight, out of mind. A lot of the underground pipes were put in post World War II, and everybody says, "Oh, well, that's just after the war." Well, that's 70 years ago. And sewer lines, if you take care of them well, will last 100 years. But if you don't take care of them, they'll start to fall apart much faster than that. So the example of that was up in Manchester. Their board was very proud of the fact they put an extra $500,000 a year into reserves for capital projects for repair and renewal. And I got their consulting engineer to do a very simple little matrix showing what kind of pipes they had in the ground, different materials, ductile iron, PVC, asbestos cement, whatever. And when it was put in, pre-1900, 1900, 1920, 1920, 1940, how many miles, and then also how much per foot it typically costs to replace around Manchester. And also the useful life of the different kinds of pipe in their soil and in this climate. And what it showed was they had about $30 million of pipe that was already beyond its useful life. The chairwoman said, "I guess you're telling us we don't have enough money." And I said, "Yeah, that's sort of the story." That doesn't mean it's all going to fall apart tomorrow, but it means if you've got stuff that's past its useful life, you've got to be ready for things to head south. Things will go wrong sooner rather than later. So you don't need to spend a bundle of money inspecting every foot of line, although there are lots of engineering firms that would love to do that for you. But you do need to have some sense of what condition your system is in, and start putting aside some funds for that. That being said, that being the fourth piece of the revenue requirements, operating costs, existing debt, future capital projects, and reserves, that's how much money you need to get. And from that, you subtract whatever you get in miscellaneous revenues, late fees, any other kind of thing. If you treat septage for other people or anything like that, you subtract that from the revenue requirements. And what's left is what you need to get from rates. And then what a cost of service is you take that number and you allocate those costs to different functions, to collection, to treatment, to pumping, to customer service. And then you use that as the basis for developing rates so that some customers, for example, treatment costs, if you have customers with higher strength sewage, some portion of the treatment cost would go to that high strength sewage that's stronger than regular sanitary sewage, because it costs more for you to treat that sewage per gallon than if it were domestic sewage. Things like that. And then you figure out how to allocate those costs. Customer service costs, if it's just billing, it doesn't cost any more to bill somebody with a big meter than a little meter. So you'd probably allocate those costs based on the number of meters or customer accounts. If your customer service charge includes meter maintenance, well, you would because you're in the sewer business. But some things you may allocate based on the size of their line. Some things you may just allocate based on the volume of sewage. So you go through that detailed thing, so you treat everybody the same way. Every person gets to pay the same unit cost for the same kind of service. But if some people get some services that other people don't get, they pay differently. But I mean, it's like a big, if you go back to good old days when I was in accounting school, it's like a big old 13-column worksheet, and you allocate the cost across. Now it's an Excel spreadsheet, but yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Real quick. Under your, you say define operation cost. Does Manchester, as an example, do they have any operation costs where they pay fees or revenues
To the town?
to the town?
Yeah, absolutely. You should reimburse the town for services they give you. If they handle your personnel matters, you should pay some portion of their personnel costs. If they handle your data processing, you should pay some portion of that. If they give you office space, you should pay for that, but on the same basis as everybody else pays, the same cost per square foot or whatever. The idea is you want to pay your fair share, but not more than that, unless you make a conscious decision that we're going to make a profit and dump it in the general fund. And that's a legal matter. I'm not a lawyer. I mean, you talk to a lawyer before you start doing stuff like that.
Have you ever heard of that?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And in those situations, was it legal?
It was, and the townspeople didn't care because what they were doing was they were providing a lot of service outside the town. And so they were happy to more or less overcharge for sewage because they were getting money from outside town customers, and it helped hold down property taxes in the town. Some communities say, we're going to be good neighbors, we'll charge people outside town the same as we charge people inside town. Others say, hell no, we're entrepreneurs. They want service from us, they're gonna pay a fair price, and our citizens are taking the risk, the operational risk, the financial risk, the legal risk, so they're entitled to a reward. So, I mean, it's really a policy decision that you all need to make. Yes, ma'am.
So if one of these cost of service studies were done, would you be able to do a dual analysis of what it would cost to continue with a single fee for all people?
Sure.
As opposed to the cost to do a rate
Yes.
for flow of use. So
Okay.
basically, would there be two
After you
numbers?
define the cost, then the next thing you do is say, what kind of rates do we want to use to produce those? And you typically look at 2 or 3 different rate designs, each of which would produce the same amount of money. The difference is how they impact certain kind of customers. So if you charge everybody $100 a quarter per household, that's one rate. If you charge based on gallonage, that's another rate. If you're in a community that pushes conservation and you want an inclining block rate where the more you use, the more per gallon, that would be another rate. I mean, so you can look at a bunch of different rates or variations. You can look at rates where the first quantity is really designed, first quantity of sewage, you only pay for the operating costs. You call that a lifeline rate. So you got retirees or somebody,
Right.
low-end user, only pays so much, and then you put all your capital costs in a slightly higher rate, so that anybody uses, and everybody gets the first quantity at the low price, and then anything above that, everybody pays a higher rate.
So if,
There's all kinds of different ways you can design rates to produce the same amount of revenue.
right, so the capital improvements that we would need to do as a town, and we don't have currently usage, we just charge a flat rate.
Okay,
So
that's simple.
So the amount that the capital that we would need to then be able to meter people's homes would be included in the study, correct?
Well, there are lots of meter companies that would be glad to, well, can't you get consumption data from local water
We
utilities?
already need
The
to
water
put our
company.
businesses
Yeah, businesses already do that. The water company has the meter.
Well, you could pay them to get the data.
Yeah.
It'd be a lot cheaper than putting in meters of your own or all that kind of stuff.
But for individuals, to be able to do that.
I mean, single-family homes typically have water meters in this part of the world. And you could get the local water utility to give you that data. You may have to pay them a price.
Yes. That's what I
And you
mean,
have to
like, that would all
negotiate
be-
with them so you're not taken advantage of, but
Cause something on paper might look cheaper, but when you go to ask them for the data, that's an additional cost.
well, what they should do is give you a computer file once a quarter or once a month or whatever frequency you use. And that really shouldn't cost more than a couple $100 at most. I mean, so you're talking an expenditure of maybe a couple $1,000 a year.
Well, we do that now for commercial properties.
So you're just expanding it to residential, yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, if you choose to, I'm not saying you should. You look like you would.
speak for it.
Yeah.
In your
Yeah.
experience, if you, once a decision is made to go on a switch from like a flat rate to a usage rate,
Mhm.
over time, don't you see that when people become conscious of what they're actually using and make an effort to reduce, let's say,
No.
do we
The problem is,
So
that's a great theory.
collection comes on?
That's a great theory, and economists love it, and environmentalists love it.
That's what I'm
But
asking.
the truth of the matter is that your water bill, and most people think of it as the water bill, even if it's water and sewer and solid, is such a small percentage of your total household expenses that you really, really have to jack up the rates in order to get anybody to voluntarily reduce their consumption. Like out in California right now, where there's a terrible drought, people are using less water. People will, when they sense an emergency, cut back on their use of water and thereby generate less sewage. But as soon as that threat goes away, no matter what the water rates are, their usage is going to go back up. The one thing that is happening, though, independent of prices or anything, across the country, we're seeing it, and everybody else in the industry is seeing consumption going down by about 1 to 1.5% per year per household, because low flow fixtures are, making their presence known in the inventory. Kids are having conservation beat into their heads in school, and it's just sort of becoming part of the ethic, and people are more aware of it now. You see lots of utilities pushing for, xeriscape, low irrigation kind of landscaping and stuff like that. So people are using less water and generating less sewage
Per year.
per household per year, and it keeps going down every year. So if you got to take that into account. Like you might say, we tell clients, well, you may be getting new customers, but your existing customers are using less water.
Yeah.
So the net effect may be almost zero.
Okay, yeah, that's a kind of line.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, if you did move to using water sewage as an index of sewage usage, wouldn't that penalize people who have swimming pools or irrigation systems, sprinkler systems?
Would indeed, and that's a policy decision you need to make. You can. There's some places, on a year-round basis, about 80% of what you take into the house as water goes back into the sewer system. In the wintertime, it's almost 100%. In summertime, it's more like 50%. So if people have swimming pools and water lawns and stuff like that, that doesn't really generally go back into the sewer system. What some communities do is limit they will either have a fixed rate and tie it to winter water usage, or they will say, we're going to bill you per gallon, but we will cap the gallons we bill you at no more than 120 or 130% of what you use in the wintertime. Because people do use more water for bathing and stuff like that in the summertime. But there are utilities that will say, if you use twice as much in the summertime water as you use in the wintertime, we're going to limit it for calculating a sewer bill to 130% of the water you use in the wintertime. So if somebody has no outside use, their bill wouldn't go up at all.
Thank you.
I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can do it. It's just a question of what is comfortable for you.
I agree.
Okay, some of the things we've learned in some of the past organizational stuff. You got to worry about your workforce first. They have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and you shouldn't dismiss it. You need to get their opinions. You need to actively solicit their opinions and their knowledge. We always suggest putting together an employee teams of different sorts to look at different aspects to help come up with suggestions to improve stuff. You also need to take into account customer and community needs. There may be great ways you could save money, but if it's not acceptable to the community, and I can't think off the top of my head about wastewater, solid waste. We did some work for San Francisco when Diane Feinstein was the mayor, and we said, look, you guys could save a boatload of money collecting trash if you had people put their trash on the front curb instead of making trash trucks, smaller trash trucks, go down back alleys behind houses. And the city's chief engineer smiled and said, Diane doesn't like to see trash out front, it's bad for tourism. So, I mean, even though it would save them a boatload of money, it was a non-starter.
They have to now put their food scraps
Separately.
yes, but
Yeah.
on the street. I've seen it on the street there.
Well, they have made some changes since then, since Diane left.
A lot of big changes.
Well, if you get squeezed enough financially,
Yeah.
you start compromising.
Very true.
You can be very high-minded and very
And then reality
deluxe,
comes.
you know, when you have lots of money.
Yeah.
The things, if you look at slide 5, the typical things that people want to look at when they do an organizational study, how effective is it? You know, do we have the right kind of people? Do we have too many bosses and not enough Indians? You know, do we have the right mix of skills? Are people trained the right way? Are people that should be licensed? Those kind of things. And then you look at your business practices. People are using more and more automation so they don't have to constantly re-enter data. Even if you got work crews out in the field, people now use handhelds to enter data in the field instead of trying to write stuff and then enter it into a computer when they get back to the office. Stuff like that. There's lots of things you can do to eliminate duplication of effort, to cut down on the level of effort, cross-train people so that they can fill in for other people when they're gone. You also have to take into account any labor agreements you might have. You can't go messing with organized labor agreements. Do you have the right kind of management operating controls in place? An example of that, this is going back a long time, in South Norwalk. We did some work for, I can't remember the state's attorney or district attorney, the South Norwalk Electric Works. Had a real sweet scheme going. They had everybody on the board, the executive director and the plant manager and the accountants all in cahoots. And they would, for example, issue a purchase request to buy weed killer to get weeds off the electric poles. They'd solicit bids, they would pick a fictitious company. The plant manager would sign a receiving report, the finance guy would cut the check, the commissioners would sign it, and then they'd all split the proceeds.
Say that again?
It's perfect audit trail.
You're going hard.
Perfect audit trail. I really felt sorry for their outside auditor because everything was in
Were their
place.
bills commensurate with the
Yes.
normal UI?
No.
Higher?
They were higher,
Yeah.
and it's one of the few times we ever worked someplace where we could actually recommend a rate cut. We suggested they could lower their electric rates by about 10% because of all the theft and fraud. They gave the general manager a car because he was on call 24/7. That's not unusual. However, they bought a top-of-the-line Cadillac for him.
Oh,
And
Not an SUV, it's a Cadillac.
he charged them $400 a month to store their car in his garage. I mean, it was pretty outrageous. So you gotta have the controls, in place to make sure things like that don't happen, because you have to have credit. First of all, you have stewardship responsibility, and secondly, you need to have credibility with your customers. So, I mean, when you go into a study to look at an organization, in Manchester, the one we just finished several months ago, the concern there was the new town manager had been transferring people from the utilities department into engineering or public works, and then the utilities felt they weren't getting the adequate attention and service they needed from engineering and things like that. And some of their line crews were moved into public works and were put to work cleaning catch basins and stuff like that rather than focusing on water lines or sewer lines. So, I mean, you got to have an arrangement that works for you. You got to have, you know, a little give and take with the rest of the town. But I mean, you have a tremendous responsibility, and you need to, you know, do what you have to make sure you can provide the service to your customers at a reasonable cost. One of the assumptions, anytime you do something like this, is that, and it says this later in the presentation too, but the first thing you have to make sure your workforce knows and the town knows is this is not a witch hunt. You're not trying to get somebody. You're not trying to arbitrarily cut staffing. In fact, you might end up deciding you need more staff. But I mean, people need, because anytime you do a study like this, the workforce gets very nervous. It's a natural reaction. And so you need to really reassure them that you're not out to do them in. But the assumptions when you're looking at the operations of the WPCA, you got to comply with the law. You want to be self-sufficient financially. You want to be businesslike. You should, going back to your question, you should reimburse the general fund for services they provide you, but you should reimburse them on the same basis they charge everybody else. They shouldn't. We had a city in Western Maryland where they charged half of the data processing budget to the water and sewer system because they could, not because they used half of the services.
Well, let me ask you something. We have trucks.
Yep.
Pump trucks.
Yep.
They belong to the WPCA.
Yep.
Can the town charge us rent for those trucks?
Not if you pay for them.
So that leads me to your first bullet on assumptions, meet legal and regulatory requirements. How do we enforce those?
Well, I was really talking more about the environmental laws and regulations, not.
Well, aren't they under the environmental laws? EPA?
What? Not of whether or not the town can take your trucks. I mean, that's a matter of common law.
Mm-hmm.
That's not specific to any environmental law.
Okay.
I mean, that's something for your attorney for the WPCA to tell you under Connecticut. There's some towns that have asserted that we have the authority to create a WPCA, so we have the authority to dissolve it, and we can do what the hell we want with its assets. So, I mean, you don't want to get caught in that kind of argument.
Has that happened before?
I'm sure there are a couple that have been dissolved. I mean, if the town's smart, they want to stay as far away from the WPCA as possible. The town has its plate full with all kinds of 100 other things. This is a specialized entity that focuses just on wastewater. That's all it does. It doesn't depend on taxes. It pays its own way. The town should be grateful that it's got a board of people to, you know, to run the business for it.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Can I just ask,
Sure.
what's the usual composition of boards that run WPCAs?
Well, if they're politically appointed, it can be the mayor's brother-in-law. You know, it can be, you know, but typically what you try to do is get a mix of, you ideally would like an engineer, a financial person, a lawyer, somebody to represent citizen constituencies, you know, senior citizens. If you're in a place where where people are upset about growth, you may want somebody from the real estate community on the board. But I mean, you want a balance of skills. You don't want all lawyers. You'd never get anything done. You don't want all engineers because you'd build, you know, a zillion things.
Or all 10 council persons?
No, you don't want all 10 council persons on it.
Well, that's what we have
See,
now.
that's what we have right now.
Yeah, that's not
And
what
that's
we
it,
want.
it's only the,
only
nobody
us.
else, but,
That's
So
not
yes,
what
we have the whole town, and then the little cherry on top is we also get the WPCA.
Well, we did some work out in the edge of Cape Cod in Duxbury, and Sally Heath was the chairman of the Water Commission, and she fiercely guarded it. They had 3 commissioners. They were appointed by the selectmen, but each member of the Water Commission got $50 a year, but the chairman got $100. So she said that was fine, and they pooled their money and used it to buy coffee and soft drinks for meetings. people who are dedicated. It shouldn't be a paid political plum. I mean, lots of places in New Jersey, they would pay people who served on a commission like this $10,000 a year just for showing up once a month for a meeting. It's political payola. You know, so,
That's how Hartford does it.
I know.
I think New Haven was like 6,000 a year.
I don't know what New Haven pays now. We worked with them way back when, 30 years ago, when they set up the WPCA. And at that time, people did not get paid to serve on the WPCA. I don't know what they're doing now. But the thing you really need, the thing that I keep on trying to emphasize to people, if you go into an oversight board and you say you want to keep rates and bills low, so now, the important word is over time. The way you keep bills low over time is by putting money into maintenance. You build very expensive facilities, and if you don't maintain them, they only last half as long as they should. The way you keep people's bills down is by keeping them in good shape and making them last as long as they can. That's not very glamorous, but it's really important. If you can get a pipe to last 100 years instead of 50 years, you know, you've saved a bunch of money, and people's bills are a lot lower than they would be. So, the other thing is, you need to have regular rate increases. I know that's not a popular position, but if you raise rates 3 or 4% a year, nobody will get too bent out of shape, and you will avoid the likelihood of ever having to have a 20 or 30% increase in rates. That first time we worked for Manchester 10 years ago, they had like a 45% rate increase because they hadn't raised rates in 18 years. So you need to raise rates. Your costs go up every year, so you should raise your prices a little bit every year. And that heads off the likelihood of big rate increases, which that's what really pisses people off. Yes, ma'am.
But in the study that you do, you would be looking at what the fair rate would be to charge, because it's
not a fair rate, it's whatever I mean, what you spend drives what you charge. It's not a matter of it being fair, it's whatever you spend you have to recover, because you gotta pay your own way. This is, you know, the difference between running something like a WPCA and running the town general fund. Elected officials can say, well, the tax rate's gonna be so many mils, and that defines what the town spends out of the general fund. In your case, what you spend defines what you have to charge. And whether it's an independent WPCA board or the town elected officials serving as the board, with all respect, you don't have a lot of control over what you spend. What you do is driven largely by state and federal law and regulation. I mean, if you have a crew out working and you have somebody down in a manhole, you gotta have somebody up top, that's OSHA laws. I mean, you really don't have a whole lot of flexibility, and your standards for how clean your effluent has to be and everything are all defined by permits. So you can sort of tweak around the edges a little bit, but it's not the kind of thing where somebody can just arbitrarily say, well, we're only gonna raise rates 4%.
I noticed you went down to keeping the cost rates and bills low. But you skipped the one before it, which is town is not aiming to make a profit.
Well, that's the assumption we always make unless somebody says they are trying to make a profit. Now, there's a difference between making a profit and being reimbursed for services. If you reimburse them for the services they provide, then they're not making a profit, they're just covering their costs. But if they charge you a penny more than that, they are making a profit.
But we don't know that.
Well, they should have a basis for what they charge you. I mean, every town does an indirect cost allocation plan because they're required to be eligible for federal and state grants. And that sets forth the basis for how they allocate costs among departments and stuff like that. So you should be able to, I mean, if
your analysis, your study, if we go with this, your study would determine that for us?
If that's what you want us to do. I mean, basic thing, like out in Duxbury, we said, okay, let's look at the town purchasing department. The way to allocate, and we know what the purchasing department costs, we said, let's allocate the cost based on the number of purchase orders for the water and sewer system as a percentage of the total number of purchase orders. Personnel department, let's take the direct employees of the water and sewer utilities as their salaries as a percentage of, you know, the total number, or their number of headcount as compared to the total headcount in the town. use a basis like that. If you're talking about rent, how many square feet of town hall does the water and sewer utilities occupy as a percentage of the total cost, that kind of thing. I mean, you could spend a fortune studying this kind of stuff, and I don't know that you'd come up with anything a whole lot more precise or accurate. It's really a question of what level of trust you have and what level of distrust you have. And sometimes these things just happen, like we did some work, our offices are in the city of Annapolis, and we just did some work for them. They had to raise their water and sewer rates 100%. They hadn't raised them forever. They'd been subsidizing them from the general fund. One of the things we discovered was that they were giving like a 60% discount to the Naval Academy. And I said to the mayor, why? Well, we've always done it. I said, you know, they don't pay taxes, they do bring tourists in, but they consume a lot of city services, and you don't get paid any revenue from them. Why would you discount their water and sewer services? And every penny you give them as a discount is a penny more your citizens, voters, need to pay. He said, yeah, that's a point. And I said, it's not like they're going to pick up and leave. And if they do, you'll have 400 acres of prime waterfront you could redevelop. So, I mean, the Naval Academy wasn't very happy. If I had kids that want to go to the Naval Academy, they probably wouldn't get in. But I mean, you have to look at stuff like that. You got to charge people fairly for what you give them.
The study that we are contemplating you performing, is it assuming that the town will be the entity that's continuing to?
I'm not making any assumptions.
Well,
It's a question of what you want.
I don't even know if we have the authority to hire you, to be frank with you.
Yeah, you probably do, but you may not have any funds. The town may squeeze your funds.
We'll find them. Yeah, we'll put our town council hats on for that.
Say that again?
I believe we would have the authority, because this is an
I
enterprise.
think we do.
Yeah, this
That's
is an
a question for
enterprise
your
fund.
attorney. I couldn't answer that
And
question.
we are the.
And the
reason
Yeah.
But do we have, will the town not give us money?
ahead of us.
Shoot.
No, the money is within the enterprise fund. So it's not gonna come out of the general fund study, it would have to come
Well,
out of the
that's for,
WPCA budget.
Okay.
No, this year on contractual services, which none of us approved, and I don't think the previous council did either, I found $60,000 that went to Arcadis for reports that we've never seen.
Okay, this is an
So,
engineering firm.
it's out of, at WPCA money.
Well, you should certainly have, they should
Have
be
you asked for
public
the
records.
reports?
I mean,
Yeah.
you should have the reports.
Yeah, that we can ask for finally, because I just found it listed when I got it
Well,
back
the
out.
basis for my other question was that I was approached this week by, the, starts with a D.
Darth Vader?
Veritas?
They're an offshoot of PSG, and they run WPCA, shoot. Yes, thank you. And they run various WPCAs in Danbury and New London, and their pitch to me was that they come in and
They'll do
do
everything.
everything
Yeah,
for the
they
town.
will. There are several engineering firms that have offshoots that operate water and sewer systems. There are investor-owned utilities that have also set up operating subsidiaries, and they will come in and you're going to spend a fair amount of money on legal fees up front negotiating a contract, because if you took the standard contract they offered you, you'd be very foolish. They would smile a lot. So, I mean, you need to be ready to negotiate hard with them, and you need to have a very specific scope of work. Like they would say, for example, our fee covers everything, but for capital expenditures more than $5,000, you have to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so you find a lot of $6,000 capital expenditures that you could have done 2 repairs for $2,000 each, instead.
If you did it yourself. Right?
Yeah. And they would also buy. One of the things they often do is buy services from their parent. So if you needed engineering work, their parent has an engineering arm and they would buy their services from that engineering arm, which may be perfectly good, but you wouldn't have much control over who they hired. And they would say, well, here's the cost, and so you need to, that's something that works for some communities. If you don't have the gumption or the resources to run the thing yourself, that can work. Or if you just can't get people who are willing to serve on a board and oversee the thing, that could work. We did it up in up on the Albany, up in the Hudson River, in no, something Falls, way up north of Albany. I have to think about that one. They were happy. They did it for about 10. I'm sorry. Glens Falls, yeah. And they were happy with it. They did it for about 10 years, and then they decided to bring it back in-house. One of the things you need to think about is, do you want to, if you negotiate a contract like that, do you want to say that that company has to give your present workforce first dibs on jobs?
That was the first thing out of my lips.
Yeah,
was that,
that how aggressively do you want to protect your present workforce, kind of thing?
Very.
But
I didn't,
Yeah.
I didn't go any further with just this discussion because, yeah,
I mean, those are all things you need to think about.
because the way that the atmosphere is here, but I'm touching that. So, but it's still an option, but down the
Let me
road.
ask a question.
Sure.
In the case of the report you're going to give us, I would assume that the company, the towns or cities that hire these outside firms to manage them haven't got the management skills or.
Well, they often don't. They won't pay for them. That's one of the reasons why you do hire an outside operator. If you really should be paying $100,000 a year for somebody to be your plant superintendent, and you're paying them $60,000 a year, you're either going to have a very dedicated person who works for a lot less than they should be earning, or you're going to get a second-rate plant superintendent. And these guys will come in and they won't have a full-time plant superintendent. They'll have some sort of a mid-level person, but they'll have a plant superintendent who's really well qualified, but who's responsible for 3 utilities instead of just yours. And so they can pay a higher salary, but spread it over 3 utilities. Same thing with engineers and professionals like that.
Okay. Now, would your report indicate a level of competence or weakness or whatever you want to call it at that level? Is that a part of your?
We would. It depends on the scope of work, what you want us to do.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if you want an organizational assessment, it's one thing. If you want a rate study, it's something else. I mean, but it's a function of what you want. We don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of study or work plan. It's really tempered to what the client needs and wants.
I just want to make sure I understand where we are in this process. This is an informational,
Yeah,
you're providing
absolutely.
information to us.
Absolutely.
We would have to write the terms of reference and an RFP
Absolutely.
out, and
And,
you would be
Yeah.
presumably responding
We would
to
respond to
something
it,
like that.
absolutely. And I would advise you strongly to have your lawyer review all that stuff before you issue anything, just to make sure you're not, giving away the company store.
Absolutely. No, and it's, for me, I do consulting for a living, and this is very informative to know kind of what the bounds are that we should be thinking about in creating an RFP.
Yeah.
I have another question on this same page. When you talked about when the town provides services on a transparent basis, would, instead of a generic, you owe this much, does that mean that
You should be able to determine how they calculate those amounts.
all right, would it be as low a level as, say, the WPCA's submitting a request for service from them?
It could be. I mean, for instance, if you have,
But it should be documented, that's what I'm
yeah,
trying to
you
get
need
at.
to document everything. I mean,
Okay.
for instance, insurance costs. You would hope that they would say, well, the book value or the replacement cost of the WPCA facilities is X millions, and the rest of the town stuff is Y millions, and so you pay that percentage of the insurance premium. I mean, and it should be documented so people can understand where the numbers come from. You can't just pull them out of the air. Well, I mean, you could, but people will start asking questions just the way you are. One of the things you always want to do is some benchmarking, like on page 7. That was, I don't remember which utility we pulled that from, but what you pick, you can measure things to death. You can come up with 100 measures and it all blur together. And you really need to pick the half dozen or at most 10 indicators of what really measures the performance of your WPCA. Is it the average annual bill? Is the number of employees per million gallons of sewage treated? Is it the, you know, what are the indicators? How many maintenance people do you have per mile of line? How many breaks per year are there? I mean, you need to come up with the key indicators. If you measure everything, it just becomes a big gray blur, and you spend a lot of money and time and don't get anything for it. So you need to identify the things that are really important measures of performance for your organization. And then you compare them with adjacent communities and with comparable communities. There may be communities that are the same size, same characteristics that are nowhere near Stratford, but you would compare yourself with them as well as the people next door. It wouldn't do any good to compare you to New Haven or Hartford, because they're completely different creatures, in different sizes, different communities. If you were looking at an organizational or operational review, this slide on page 8 is sort of a generic thing about what the steps you go through. You gather a bunch of data in the first phase. You send out data requests. You have some meetings to make sure everybody's on the same page. Then you spend some time on site. You interview people. You look at stuff. And depending upon, I mean, if, for instance, I've got a guy on my staff who's a retired executive director of several water and sewer authorities, with 35 years, you know, he's PE and all that kind of stuff. If you just want a fairly top-down look at engineering stuff, I'd use him. If you wanted a really detailed inspection of facilities, we'd either use your engineering firm or we'd find one and hire one for it. It's really a question of how in-depth you really want to go. And then you look at, you know, how the different functions and departments in WPCA would work. And then you formulate, you know, what do we find, you know, what are our findings, what are our conclusions, what does it mean, what are our recommendations, what should we do, kind of thing. I mean, that's the typical thing that you do in a study when you're looking at the organization. I mean, different things if you were doing a rate study, but if you're looking at the organization, this is sort of a typical thing. And the next page on page 9 is just, you know, actually I think we stole this from the Manchester work plan. I think this was the work plan in Manchester. We always tell people you don't want to study everything to death. You want to pick the things that are either big ticket items or areas where you know you have a problem. You don't want to, like we did a management review of a county in Maryland and made a board of electrical inspectors with a budget of $10,000 a year. And the county's budget was like $100 million a year. And I said, we're not even going to go near them. It would cost more than $10,000 to look at them. It's not worth it. So let's just focus on the big ticket things where you spend a lot of money or where you know you have problems, and not worry about the nickel and dime things. You have a question?
I was just, the thought occurred to me that one of the areas that, I don't know if it would take precedence in your study, but one of the areas that I think have a major problem is Superstorm Sandy. I mean, we were literally feet away from having the plant inundated with flood water.
It wasn't.
It wasn't, but we were feet away from having it happen.
And rising sea levels.
And rising sea levels, and from what I understand, when the plant was upgraded, DEEP didn't allow us to have a release valve. So if the
That's
plant,
right. That's one way to prevent overflows or spills.
right. So if the plant had gotten inundated during Superstorm Sandy, guess what was going to happen in your bathroom?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's to me is a major point where we need to.
That's really more of a design consideration. I mean, that's where you'd really want an engineer to look at something like this. We would find obvious things, but some of the more subtle things,
You're more concerned with management.
we're more concerned with management and finances
Finances.
than with design. I mean, there are lots of engineering firms that would be glad to do a design review for you.
Okay.
But I mean, this on page 9 is the typical kind of work plan for something like this. And again, it can be as top down as you want, or as very detailed bottoms up kind of study. It's really a question. I mean, I generally discourage very detailed studies because they cost a lot of money, and I'm not sure they produce a whole lot more than a limited scope, top down kind of thing. The other thing we typically come up with out of a study like this is a list of recommendations. And some things you can just do, they're no-brainers. We worked for a county in Maryland, it's a small county, and they had 9 different contracts for paper, for copiers. And we said, you get a hell of a lot better price if you had one contract. And they said, well, where are we going to store all the paper? And I said, well, you write that into the contract. They deliver it as you request it. I mean, you don't need a consultant for that. But I mean, but some things you can just implement, some things you may decide you're not interested in, and other things you may want to study further. But I mean, that's the typical kind of thing you get out of a study. There's some things you can do right away, some things you may want to think about, and some things you may want to study further. And this, the sort of fundamentals there on page 10. You want it to be methodical. You can't get hung up just reliving the past over and over again. These guys did something wrong 20 years ago and we've never gotten over it. You need to focus on what's going to happen in the future. You can't undo the past. And you really, and the other thing in the public sector, changes need to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. You can't do dramatic different changes because people resist it, both the workforce and the public. So you do it gradually. That doesn't mean you do it at a snail's pace, but you don't try to change the world overnight. And again, focus on big ticket items. The example I always use, if you're in business for yourself and somebody's stealing $5,000 a year worth of paper clips, and it's going to cost you $10,000 to prevent it, you say, the hell with it, let them have the paper clips. You don't do that in the public sector because you would be subject to criticism for not being good stewards of public resources. So you would spend the $10,000 to stop them from stealing $5,000 worth of paper clips. So you got to have some sense of perspective as to what. And the other thing I really want to emphasize, it's not guaranteed you're going to come out of this with suggestions for a smaller staff. You might come out of it with suggestions for a larger staff or a different staff. We did some work for a sewer utility in Virginia where they had horrendous amounts of overtime and they had a lot of staff turnover. And we recommended that they really needed to hire more operators for all 3 shifts. They were a 3-shift operation. That's not what the county board of supervisors wanted to hear. But I said, you have tremendous turnover. You're just waiting for a major accident. People literally working 100 hours a week, routinely. The money was good for them, and the county said, well, we're saving on all the benefits, but it's just a disaster waiting to happen. So you may not come out of this with the recommendation to have fewer people. And slide 11 was just typical kind of schedule, that if you do something like this, it typically takes a couple months until you get a draft report. Depending on the time of year, if you do stuff like this in the summer when everybody's on vacation, it may take longer till you get people there. If you try to do it at the end of the year, over the holidays when everybody's on vacation, that also makes it difficult. So you need to pick the timing as to when you want to do it. And then there are a couple of examples I included. Danville, Virginia. Danville is a city of 40,000 people. We had a really large employer, Dan River Mills, the textile company. We used to employ 11,000 people in the city. That was 12 years ago. Now they employ 0 people in the city. So it's a devastating blow to the city's economy. And we looked at all their departments, not just utilities, but we had to make some recommendations that were really not pleasant to make, like cutting the number of sworn police officers, closing a branch library, things like that are never ever pleasant to make, but they just could not sustain themselves. They did not have enough money. They were eating up every penny they had in reserves anywhere, and they just had to cut their costs.
Do you do this on a statewide basis?
We've never done it for state. I'm not sure there's
And how
an
many
army of
people are in your
consultants.
company?
I'm not sure there's an army of consultants large enough to do that.
Can I ask you a question just out
Sure.
of curiosity for Danville? They not only had sanitation, but they had water, gas, electricity.
Yeah.
They owned all those?
Well, they do. They own them, and they bought natural gas and distributed it, but they generated their own electricity, and they made a boatload of money doing it. That was a cash cow for the city, because they sold electricity to people for 30 miles around. So that was sort of the sacred cow in the city. That was the only thing that saved them from declaring bankruptcy, was the revenues they produced from electricity.
We have that in Connecticut. There's a few towns that have their own electric companies, their own water companies.
Norfolk has.
Well,
That's
like
a
the water.
electric company that.
Well, I'm sure they're better now than when we worked there 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Will this report, in a sense, serve also as a performance audit, or is
Of
there
sorts.
different
Of sorts.
aspects?
Yeah, of sorts. We just need to make sure that nobody, that the workforce knows this is not a witch hunt. We're not trying to crucify the workforce.
We already did that, so.
Can I ask, how much does a typical report cost? If you
Depends
have
what,
this
depends what you want done.
But if you have this 8-week schedule with like,
In Manchester, they had us do 2 things. They had us do a rate study and a management study at the same time. And there were the 2 of them together cost less than if you'd done them separately, because we could gather
Sure.
a lot of data at the same time. But I think in Manchester, I think the rate study, I think was slightly less than $40,000, and I think the management study was slightly less than 30. If you had done them separately, they both would have been more than that. Each would have been more than that.
Yeah.
But because there's overlap, you could get some economies of scale.
can I just ask about the finalization process?
Sure.
Do you give your clients the opportunity to comment on the recommendations before you
Absolutely.
take pen to paper?
Well, yeah, we never want to blindside
Yeah.
anybody. We don't change recommendations because they're politically unpopular. But we do listen to advice and temper how you might phrase certain things to make them more palatable. Because we don't pretend to understand the subtleties of politics in every community where we work.
Very good, thank you.
James City County down in Virginia was a similar kind of thing. Their issue down there was their high growth, their retirement. They include Williamsburg, and so a lot of retirees move down there, and so there's different demands for services there than in other places. In Virginia, the county is a typical unit of government rather than the city or town. Some of their counties are no bigger than a city. I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, the very last page is what, this is what typically would be involved. You document what the situation is now. You get the WPCA board to agree on its goals and objectives and its policies, and based on that, you come up with a list of, a prioritized list of improvements or changes to get you to where you want to be, and you get some kind of roadmap, some time-phased roadmap to get you there, because you can't, if you're going to make any changes, unless they're really simple things, you can't do them overnight. I mean, it's not rocket science. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to ask, of your clientele, I guess what percentage come back to you again if
All
they
of them.
use you? They all come back?
Pretty much.
Okay.
I
And
mean-
how often do they come back? Do they come back like every other year?
Oh, no,
or
God, no. I mean,
Every 5
no,
years?
okay. Typically, if you're doing something like a management study, you might want to do it every 10 years.
Okay.
A rate study, when we do a rate study, we build a model, financial model, and we'll project costs for 10 years. We'll recommend specific rates for each of the next 5 years, but we insist on training the utility staff, both the engineering and the financial people. Because what we say is you do a study like a rate study every 5 or 7 years, but in between, the staff uses that model when you're going through your budget process every year. Because your rates are determined by what you spend. So if you're going to have a budget that says I'm going to spend $1 million, you want some assurance that you're going to have rates that'll produce $1 million, more or less. It doesn't matter if you go over or under in any one year, but over time, you pretty much have to match what you take in with what you spend. It's like a checking account. So, I mean, you don't want to do something like this too often. It diverts people from what they do day to day. It makes people nervous. And frankly, I think it would be a waste of your money to do it too often. What are the issues you face other than? I mean, one of the first things that I would suggest, if you look at some kind of management review here, I'd say the first issue to look at is governance.
Yes.
That's-
Well, my concern is, I want to ensure, I'd like to be sure rather, that the town administration isn't using the authority as their piggy bank to handle other issues, to handle other town issues. I don't know if your performance, I don't know if your
Yeah,
I
performance.
don't know any elected officials who would ever do that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It has been known to happen. It has been known to happen. This same county in Virginia, where we recommend they hire more people, the superintendent for the water system had been putting money aside for years to build a new reservoir because they were a high growth area, and getting a reservoir built takes forever. And he had accumulated $60 million towards what was going to be a $100 million reservoir. And the county board came along and said, you know, that would pay for about half of a high school. We had put up a long fight to prevent the county board from taking that money for a high school. There's nothing wrong with building a high school, but you don't want to build it with money that sewer customers paid for.
And there was no state regulation or state statute?
Well, there was, but
Yeah.
that was a slight detail with the county board. That we told them they would get sued.
That's what happens here.
Yeah.
We told them they would get sued particularly by real estate developers who had put money into that $60 million to help guarantee capacity for them when they wanted to build. Yeah.
I know you talked about looking forward, not looking back, but I think, given the situation of the town and WPCA over the past year and a half, 2 years, it might be wise to
Oh, you need to understand
also
how you
look
got to where you
back
are.
and, yeah.
But you
and-
can't obsess over what happened.
That's right, okay.
Thank you.
No, we're not obsessing on what happened last year, we're just obsessing on what's going on right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing, you want transparency. I mean, even forgetting about the WPCA, the citizens of the town want transparency. They want to know where the money comes from and where it goes. And the typical municipal financial reports are pretty useless at that point. I mean, I used to be a partner at a big CPA firm, and this whole thing about all the changes in governmental accounting, wanting to make public sector financial reports look more like private sector financial reports. They haven't. They don't. I mean, it was a lot simpler when we had a balance sheet and an income statement instead of 97 different kind of financial statements, and you really can't figure out what things cost.
Can I just ask about your firm?
Sure.
I wasn't here at the beginning, but
We're a small specialty firm. We're financial and financial people, accountants, economists. Got 2 engineers on staff. Not that we don't do, we're careful not to practice engineering because frankly we get a lot of referrals from engineering firms. So I don't want to be perceived as competing with them. We don't design stuff, we don't build stuff, we don't sell bonds. We're we're financial and management advisors. We work all around the country. I guess our most remote client would be the Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility. Most of our work has been Atlantic and New England. We have a fair number of clients in the Midwest and the Chicago area. I'm not sure how that happened, but it did. And then we've got scatterings of clients up and down the West Coast. We are, we've been around. We got started as part of what in those days was Coopers and Lybrand, the CPA firm in the 70s, and then became part of Pete Marwick in the 80s, and left in '98 to set up our own firm. Pete Marwick was a good firm. Their cost structure was prohibitive and made it very hard for me and the people who work with me to compete because of the hourly rates they were charging for services. And I mean, it's great to have, if you want somebody who has expertise on accounting for petroleum in Indonesia, you could pick up the phone and have somebody in 30 seconds, but my clients don't need expertise like that and don't want to pay for it. So we set ourselves up as an independent firm. We're registered as a woman-owned firm in Maryland and a couple of other states. And I guess we have one location, Annapolis. And we've been doing this kind of stuff for just about 40 years.
And who's been your most recent client in Connecticut?
We just finished work in Manchester.
Manchester, okay.
Yeah,
That's most
talked with folks over there. I'm trying to remember where else. We've worked in Cheshire. We've worked years ago in Trumbull. We worked years ago in New Haven. I could get you a list of all kinds of people in Connecticut. But Manchester, we just actually gave them, I think, the final report maybe 3 or 4 months ago.
You have competition?
Sure do. There's probably another 4 or 5 firms nationally that we compete against regularly. There are also some engineering firms that try to do some of this stuff, but not very well. Like we used to compete against Ty and Bond, but they've decided that one of their guys said, we don't really, when we design stuff and build stuff, people smile and they're happy. But when you do a rate study, nobody ever likes the outcome. So we'll let you do that kind of stuff, and we'll stick to the. There are a handful of firms nationally against whom we compete. It's a fairly arcane and specialized area. We all know one another. We all go out for a beer together, but we compete against one another.
So you don't compare RFPs?
No.
I'm joking with you.
That would be illegal.
Can I ask, do you do performance audits also?
Depending, yes. I mean, it depends how you define performance audits. I mean, in the old accounting firm lingo, we don't do financial audits. We do compliance audits, and we do performance audits. Type 2, type 3 kind of audits. So, and most of our clients are municipal utilities. We work for a few investor-owned utilities, but not many. Mostly municipal utilities or local governments. Or sometimes for law firms or somebody like that is doing some work for a local government. We actually did some interesting work in Pennsylvania about a year ago. There was a borough water and sewer authority, and they knew that they were going to have some major plant replacements coming at them. So they accumulated about $20 million in reserves to offset some of the cost of rehabbing their water treatment plant. And the borough, of which had created them back 40 years ago, it was an election year, and they decided, geez, if we take the authority, the municipal authority, and dissolve it, we could take their reserves and we could lower property taxes. So there was a lawsuit, which is still going on, between the borough authority and the borough. And the borough authority's position was, you certainly have the authority to dissolve us, but you don't have the authority to take the money and use it for other purposes. And we can't turn over the plant to you because under state and federal law, you need to have an operating permit, which you don't have, and will take you at least 18 months to get. You don't have any licensed operators or anything like that, so we would be subject to personal prosecution if we turned the system over to somebody who wasn't competent and licensed to operate it. Local politics.
Huh. Yeah.
Well, the reason that we also found out why the borough decided to dissolve the authority, in addition to wanting the money, the borough authority declined to hire the new mayor's brother as their attorney.
Good reason.
Keep digging, you'll find it.
Is he sure he doesn't live here?
No, I really, no, I don't. I live on an airplane.
One after another.
So what would our WPCA governing board, so to speak, what would our next step be? Would we contact you? Would you contact us?
I don't know how you operate. I don't know your operating
have to
procedure.
We have to figure out how we operate.
Well, we may or may not.
How do you figure that?
Yeah.
If it's professional consultant, then you don't have to have an RFP.
What?
Is it prudent to find
Yeah,
out what's
so-
out
yeah,
there,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm just saying,
Yeah,
we contract if it's professional services, you're allowed to go above
as Mike-
7,500 without.
As nice as it would be if you just handed some work, you really probably have a responsibility to at least consider other people.
Mhm. I agree.
60 to 70,000, but,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we'd have to come up with a terms of reference or an RFP for this.
You need whatever your standard
Yeah.
contract is for professional services, and you need a scope of work.
Have Pete, have you ever done this before?
Well, we put out RFPs and interviewed firms. Yeah, you would have to develop a scope, so that's your first step, and you probably need a little assistance because you're a little unclear
Yeah.
what that scope's going
The
to be.
more-
so-
The more specific the scope is,
Mhm.
the easier and less expensive it would be to do something. But the more specific the scope is, the more you're limiting things and, maybe cutting out other creative solutions. So you gotta balance, the two.
All right, since we haven't done this previously, to my knowledge, unless it was very, very long time ago, if we took management and fee study as our scope,
Mm-hmm.
now that's a double scope, I
Yeah.
understand that.
That's what Manchester just did.
Okay. Would we then, if we were looking, say,
You can get the RFP at Manchester.
Yeah.
I
I was
mean,
gonna
we
suggest
may even
that
have
lots
it
of times you-
electronically.
yeah,
Yeah.
Because when Manchester issued their RFP, I think they got 3 or 4 responses.
okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, very good, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, very good.
Any other
Thank you,
questions
Mr.
while I'm here? I'll be glad to do what I can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Don't get lost on the way out.
No. Next time I'll remember, now that I've been here, I can get here. I hope so. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's funny. Joe mentioned.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, great. Let me give you
Oh, I
one.
have one too. I've got to figure out what the heck I'm gonna do with this thing. Give mine away.
Thank you, Jim.
Oh, and I'll get mine. I'll take it.
Oh, yes, that's right. You need it. You need it. Thank you very much.
Doesn't say on there, but I'm chair of the WPCA. She's chair of the.
That's a very interesting thing to put on your resume. Chair WPCA.
Are we done?
Okay, yes, thank you very much.
The meeting's adjourned?
Oh, yeah, we're adjourned.